the channel. This is my weekly content on early 20th century modernism, covering literature, art, music, architecture, design, and ID. And today we are going to look at the birth of Shirley Knight in 1936. She played Ruth in the original 1957 production of William Inger's play Bus Stop and then reprised that role for the 1960 film version. So, in this video, we are going to look at some examples of how the year she was born shaped her life and career. She was also nominated for an Academy Award for her performance as the country singer Helen Viola in the 1989 film Sweet Dreams. Or maybe you are familiar with her voice acting work like in Disney as The Rescuers or the TV show Family Dog. And the family moved to the nearby town of Inman, where her father managed a grocery store. Once again, Shirley S.'s new stepmother was incredibly supportive of her interest in performing, and would often help her younger stepsister with her dancing routines. You see, Shirley ended up in Hollywood at the perfect time. It was also an age when Hollywood was churning out a massive number of romantic comedies, musicals, and screwball comedies set in the contemporary present. Some of Shirley's favorites from this period include Roman Holiday, Sabrina, and An Affair to Remember. For example, in her first feature film, Marjorie, she played a supporting role written specifically for her, that of a naive ingenue-type character called Peggy. Shirley became known in Hollywood for playing these kinds of roles. The experience was not a happy one. However, as Monroe proved to be difficult to work with, in her autobiography, Shirley recalls that she felt threatened by Monroe's presence and felt that the press hounded her because they thought she was jealous of Monroe. Despite the off-putting behavior of the film's star, though, the film itself was a success, especially in Europe, and helped to propel Shirley's career forward. But over time, as her career progressed, she began to seek out more substantial roles and eventually went on to play leading ladies. If you did, please consider subscribing to stay in the loop on future episodes. Thanks for watching, and see you next week. These films had a huge impact on her, and the characters in them inspired her to become an actress. But it wasn't just the films themselves that appealed to her, but also the studios and stars associated with them. The star system was still going strong in Hollywood, and Shirley Knight admired the studios for their ability to put out such polished products. In particular, she loved MGM musicals, and the studio's famous logo with the lion roaring on a plain background symbolized for her the power of the movies. Even now, just hearing that sound gives me goosebumps. Just a couple of years earlier, in 1952, Walt Disney had opened Disneyland in Anaheim, which is just down the road from Los Angeles. But there were still traces of it to be found, and Shirley Knight was well positioned to benefit from it. Her own career trajectory neatly mirrors the transition from the studio system to the more individualized, project-based model that succeeded it. See, when Shirley Knight was growing up, there was no such thing as television. The very first television sets were appearing in private homes only in the late 1940s. But it wasn't until the 1950s that television really started to take off. By the end of the decade, 20% of American families owned a television set, and primetime TV was just getting started. A few years after Shirley moved up, she scored a role in the live anthology drama series Playhouse 90. This led to another part in the series, the United States Steel Hour, and eventually she landed the role that would make her famous, that of Ruth in the 1957 Broadway production of William Inger's play Bus Stop. Shirley was part of the generation that grew up with Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck and all the rest, a generation whose childhood coincided exactly with the golden age of Hollywood. For this generation, the movie theater was the primary site of their leisure time and entertainment. They spent more time in movie theaters than anywhere else, except perhaps school. It was an experience that helped to shape their tastes and desires and their sense of the possible futures open to them. Movie theaters were big community spaces where young people could meet up with friends and enjoy the latest musical or romantic comedy. Many of these films were based on popular novels from the previous decades, such as Gone with the Wind or Rebecca. And Shirley Knight saw many of these films as a child, often with her friend Tommy, who would later become famous as director and producer Francis Ford. Again, Shirley later described her stepmother as a second mother to her and said that her and her stepsister were very close. So despite the difficulties brought on by the Depression, Shirley seems to have had a pretty good childhood overall. Or maybe you have seen her in one of her many other stage or screen roles. Shirley attended Abilene High School, where she participated in several plays. After graduating in 1954, she enrolled at the University of Kansas in Lawrence to study theater. But after just one semester, she transferred to the Pasadena Playhouse in California. Now, it may be the case that you already know Shirley Knight from her acting career. But what I want to focus on today is that Shirley Knight was born in 1936. Exactly 86 years ago today. So, Shirley Knight was born in the small town of Goessel in the state of Kansas, which is where I will start today. During the Great Depression, Goessel was home to around 300 people, nearly twice its current population. But in Goessel, as elsewhere in America, the economic crisis was profound. Farming communities like Goessel especially felt the effects of the agricultural overproduction and resulting low prices that caused the Depression in the first place. And the Knight's family were no exception. Shirley's father, Lloyd, who ran a local gas station and garage, lost his business during the Depression, and the family had to move into her grandparents' house. Then shortly after Shirley was born, her mother died. And so when Shirley was just 4 years old, her father married one of his co-workers from the garage, a woman named Fern Yost, and young Shirley would later describe Fern as a real second mother to me. Fern was a huge fan of theater and would take Shirley along to see shows in Wichita. There, she would sit backstage watching the performances and afterwards would sometimes take part in the shows herself by singing with the chorus line. Fern thus introduced Shirley to the world of theater and instilled in her a lifelong love of performing. So while Goessel was an uninspiring place in many ways, the Depression era setting in which Shirley's childhood took place was actually quite formative for her future career. Now, if you don't know much about the geography of the United States, that probably doesn't mean much to you. But Goessel is right bang in the middle of the country, not far from the geographic center point of the contiguous United States. It's the sort of place that shows up in road trip movies as a detour off the main highway that gets the protagonists stranded in a town full of weirdos. In fact, it has the exact population today that it had in the 2020 census, 168 people. So even when you get there, you probably won't find much excitement there. However, when Shirley Knight was born, things were very different. When Shirley was 9, her father remarried again, this time to a widow named Dorothy, who had 2 children of her own from her previous marriage. In 1945, when Shirley was 9, the family moved to Abilene, which was to be their final stop before they would relocate to California. And now we come to the second thing I want to talk about today, which is Hollywood. However, it wasn't just movies about the past that they watched. It's true that by the time Shirley started working as an actress, the studio system was in decline, and the golden age of Hollywood was coming to a close. In the beginning, Shirley was hired by producers rather than playing characters created by studios. The last thing I want to talk about today is television. As I mentioned at the beginning, Shirley would reprise her role as Ruth 2 years later in the 1960 film version of the play, which co-starred Marilyn Monroe. And that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this episode looking back at the life of Shirley Knight and the circumstances surrounding her birth in 1936.